Debra's key appointments include being a trustee of Medic Alert, the chair of the Small Charities Coalition, and a member of the Charity Commission's SORT Committee. She's also an internationally published author on leadership and management, probably in your spare time. And I've also heard Debra speak before, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. So, over to you, Debra.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that horrible whiny noise gone? Sorry, that horrible whiny noise is me, in fact. Oh gosh, I didn't realise Bristol was so difficult to get into until I got to the station, of course, Joanne, and I was frisked and checked and asked for a passport to allow me in your hallowed remit. It's a real privilege to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. The briefer today from Wendy, she said, you know, can you come along, Debra, and sort of help to remind us of how important we are and sort of inspire us a bit. But the thing is, I've got a problem with that because I'm actually really very, very cross, and I don't know how I can be cross and inspiring at the same time. So I'm just going to be cross, and we'll see where that gets us. And I'm cross about three things, actually. I'm cross about how the small and local voluntary and community organisations and charities in this country, how we're constantly being told how unprofessional and how we're not up to the mark and we're not good enough, we can't compete with the other big boys and things like that. So I'm really cross about that. I'm hugely cross about the arrogance of those people who tell us how to do the things that we know how to do, actually, and assume that they know how to do it better when they've actually never themselves run a small local charitable organisation or been part of one of those. And also the implication that, you know, we're still these sort of unprofessional do-gooders, we're all terribly worthy. I mean, I don't actually see any sandals in the room of the description that people would normally have, and I'm just sick of it, frankly. I'm really, really cross about it. You see, what I see happening at the moment is I see all three sectors, the private, the voluntary and the public sector, being morphed into one enormous sector where actually nobody can really tell the difference between who we are at the moment. I don't think that's good for us. I don't think it's good for the private sector. I don't think it's good for government, and I don't think it's good for beneficiaries. Now, don't get me wrong, of course there's always overlap. Of course there is, and particularly between the public sector and the voluntary sector, because many of us have the same end aims in mind, even if we don't go about doing it the same way. But I think it's just getting really, really out of hand. I think that there is an important and valuable distinction between those three sectors that we ought to maintain. We have different motivations. And I see what's happening at the moment is what I'm calling the commoditisation of charitable activity. And what I mean by that is, it seems to me that over the last decade, we charities are being seen as just another mechanism for delivering public services. It feels a bit like government, in all its myriad forms, is in danger of treating vulnerable people and causes as if they're widgets, as if they're commodities. How many abused kids or people in crippling debt can you get through the system, and how cheaply? And by the way, can you demonstrate it on a piece of paper in a flowchart and stats and a couple of graphs? Yeah. The term value for money gets bandied about, which is really, I think, a euphemism for cheapest very often. And it's so frustrating. I was with another group of people last week, and there's the chief executive of a London-based advice centre, which is a small local centre, completely independent, and it gets around 90% of its income in a mix of grants and contracts, largely from the local authority. Now, two things have happened over the last year. Firstly, it won't surprise you to know that their client base, particularly in the debt advice service, has more than doubled in the last year as a result of the recession, and also their funding from the local authority has been cut as a result of the recession. So the Office of Third Sector have this programme which is called the Recession Busting Fund or something like that. So the Chief Exec trotted off, you know, full of enthusiasm and hope, to the Office of Third Sector's Recession Busting Fund and said, can I have some money, please? To which they said no, because you can't prove that the result of you needing more money is because of the recession. Now, as you can imagine, she's absolutely splitting blood, and I think she swore, in fact, and said something like, if it wasn't for your something lot, we wouldn't have people in debt, and if it wasn't for your something lot, the local authority wouldn't have had to cut its funding or worse that effect. I think she's burnt her bridges there, I might say, but well done on her for saying the truth. And actually, that's the danger of dancing too closely to statutory money. Now, I do understand, for many causes, we don't really have a huge amount of choice, particularly if they're causes that the public don't see as popular. I mean, some of the charities that I'm quite passionate about are young people's charities, where, you know, the young people are not necessarily, well, they're you know, the young people that you tend to see pilloried in the news or in the newspapers in the sun, you know, with the hoodies and things like that. The public on the whole don't want to give money to those kinds of charities, so they're very reliant on other sources. So I do understand that for many of us we don't have any choices. But I think the problem is we get stung because we forget that we're very, very different creatures, that the priorities and the issues that are faced by local authorities and central government are not the same as those faced by us. We might think we're in the same game, but we're actually not. They are subject to political whims and wheezes. They're very, very have to be responsive to what the media say, whereas we're in kind of a different place. I always think that the relationship between the state and the voluntary sector is a bit like the Aesop's fable, the fox and the scorpion. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that one. Anyway, I'll tell you. So what happens is the fox and the scorpion are on the side of a river, and both of them want to get across to the other side of the river. And of course the fox can swim, but the scorpion can't. So the scorpion says to the fox, would you mind if I hop on your back and you give me a lift over to the other side of the river? Now the fox quite rightly says, you have got to be kidding me. There is no way I'm risking having you, a scorpion, get on my back because you might sting me. And the scorpion says, of course I'm not going to sting you. That's not in my interest. You know, both of us want to get to the other side of the river. And if I stung you, we both go down, including me. So of course I'm not going to do that. So the fox thinks about it, and he's persuaded by the logic of the argument. So they sign a compact, and off they go. About halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the fox, and as they're both drowning and dying, the fox says to the scorpion, why did you sting me? And the scorpion says, I couldn't help it, it's in my nature. Now, I'm not saying that the state is the scorpion and that we're the fox. I'm not making any analogies around that. I'm simply saying that we're different creatures and we have different motivations and different pressures on us, and we have to recognise that. You know, I myself have got very cross and angry about, you know, the way in which government engages with us, but actually in many ways it's not entirely their fault, in fairness to them. Having said that, however, what the state is doing is asking us to be more business-like. That's a constant message that's coming through, to emulate the private sector, in particular to bid for and win contracts, to get into this competitive tendering regime, i.e. to be more competitive. Which I have to say, I find that extremely ironic, given that isn't it business practices that's got this economy into the mess in the first place, or did I miss something? I don't think it was charities that caused a global economic meltdown, was it? Yeah. Unless I've missed something somewhere. It really, in fact, how dare they? Listen, let me tell you something. I was asked to contribute to a debate last week about whether or not the voluntary sector had things to learn from governance of the private sector and the statutory sector. And I stood up and said, absolutely not. In fact, frankly, quite the reverse. I think they have an enormous amount that they can learn from us. And I think it's about time we shouted about that and we were proud about that. I think there is a massive moral vacuum of leadership in this country at the moment, both in the private and the public sector, but we don't have that moral vacuum in the voluntary sector. So if ever there was an opportunity for us, for goodness sake, to step up and show how well run we generally are and how good we do our jobs and how much values matter to us, if ever there was an opportunity to do it, that opportunity is now. We are not the private sector or the public sector, we're the voluntary sector. However, I do think that we are in danger of colluding in that distortion of who we are as a sector and who we are as a charitable organisation. I think we've got trapped into thinking that problems can only be solved with money. I think that very often we in the sector rock up at our local authority and say, we've got an answer to the problem, but give us the money, otherwise we can't do anything. Now, of course, money helps, of course it does, but I wonder if we've started to distort actually what it is that changes the world, that makes society better. Actually, if you look at the amount of money that's been ploughed into, for want of a better word, the social sector, into the National Health Service and so on, have things actually got better? There's been shed loads of money chucked into it, so much money that you'd think we wouldn't have any problems anymore. You'd think that we'd have cured most diseases and most people would have homes and things like that. That is clearly not the case. So I would say that's a powerful evidence that money is not actually the fundamental answer to society's problems. But I think we've been bullied, for want of a better word, so much into thinking that we can't achieve anything without money that we've kind of got trapped into that ourselves.